Okay, this video is called Is Reading a Waste of Time? And we're going to talk about cognitive reserve theory, Notre Dame Nuns study, and how do you protect yourself from cognitive decline, from becoming stupid like so many people do as they get older. So the Notre Dame Nuns study was carried out in Mankato, Minnesota, with these nuns donated their brains to science. When they died, an autopsy was performed on their brains. Nuns are a good population to study because they've been in the convent ever since they were young. They got many decades of follow-up on them. They know their risk factors. So you don't got any alcoholics. You don't got any drug addicts like the kinds you meet in the regular world. And you also had a very good history of their academic abilities when they were like teens and 20-somethings and all throughout their lives. The nuns who like to read a lot more, who like to write letters, who like to teach, they had a much lower level of cognitive decline. And I'm going to show you some of the things that got me thinking about this. Next picture here, this is a normal brain MRI. It's what's called a flare sequence. You don't need to know the technical aspects of MRI, but basically all of the brain tissue around the ventricles, these are the brain ventricles. They contain cerebrospinal fluid, so that's dark. Low in signal means dark. But everything around them, there's a little normal white capping there, but that's normal. There's no stroke lesions in the brain parenchyma, the brain tissue. All right. Now I'm going to show you some abnormal. This is a CAT scan of the brain. This is an abnormal. This is the most common thing I see every day. I've seen tens of thousands of demented patients. And what I see is the brain is pulled away from the skull. The white outline is the skull. This is the brain tissue. This is cerebrospinal fluid. Normally this brain tissue should be up in contact with the skull. As the brain shrinks, it atrophies. You get a shrunken brain and it pulls away from the skull and you get more and more cerebrospinal fluid accumulating. The ventricles are also a little bigger than they should be. This is the classic appearance of diffuse cerebral atrophy that I see all day long every day, okay, in demented patients. Now, what I want to share with you is I had an interesting patient. I sometimes see some interesting demented cases. I had this patient, a real elderly guy in his late 80s, and he had a brain that looked terrible. He had a whole bunch of what we call them deep white matter strokes like this. His brain looked worse than this, just white stuff all throughout this area, and this means stroked out brain. Okay, so as soon as you look at the brain, you say, this guy's probably demented. It was a terrible looking brain. He also had a couple of these black dots in the periphery. These are called punctate foci hemosiderin. Just means small old microbleeds. You can also call them microbleeds. You can also call this the multiple black dots differential diagnosis. And when you see them in the periphery, by far the most common thing is something called cerebral amyloid angiopathy, which is almost thought to be a subtype of Alzheimer's. I actually think it's hypertension related, and there's good reasons why I say that. But anyways, he had a pattern of what we call ischemic or vascular dementia. He had a pattern of what we call amyloid dementia. And he also had some small strokes. Little holes in the brain are called lacunae, like it means like little lakes. And so he had a couple pop, small infarcts. So by all reasonable accounts, this guy should have been demented. But I looked up his history, and he's still able to travel independently and go to his medical appointments independently. Tons of patients don't go to the medical appointments independently. They have a family member with them, or a spouse or a child with them. They're not able to drive. This guy is still functioning in the real world. He was still working. And the reason I tell you all that is because he was functioning much better than you'd expect looking at his brain. And so where is this all going? What I'm trying to say is I've seen some patients who are totally demented, can't do anything, despite the brain MRI only shows moderate atrophy. And then I've seen other guys that are still getting by despite having a disaster of a brain with tons of strokes all over the place, especially in the sort of the white matter, not in the gray matter, in the white matter. Okay, so why do I think this guy was still able to function? I think it's because he probably had a pretty high level of function before all this brain damage occurred, and that's called cognitive reserves. So the nuns that were more literate, scholarly, read a lot, taught a lot, and were more intellectual, they were less likely to be demented at autopsy despite having a lot of the extracellular senile plaques, intracellular neurofibrillary tangles characteristic of so-called Alzheimer's dementia. And so what I'm saying is just reading it all you'll develop new neuronal connections. That's one of the things that causes new neurons to grow. New neurons growing is neurogenesis. Exercise will do it. Adequate sleep helps neurogenesis. Minimizing stress, being religious, having a sense of purpose in life, all those things help you to grow new neurons. So if you're living your life like you should be, getting your exercise, ongoing reading, intelligent conversations with some friends and family, and managing your stress and being religious, your brain's going to be a lot better off. Okay, yeah, I just showed you the lacunar infarcts in there too. Okay, so here's a little more info on the Notre Dame Nuns study, Mankato, Minnesota. Like we said, they're a good standardized population, and cognitive reserve seems to protect. And so what I'm saying is just by reading, doing anything to build up new neurons and new learning, you're protecting your brain. So it's well worthwhile. Because I always like reading. I can tell you, my old ex-wife used to knock the book out of my hands. Why the F do you read so much? Life isn't in a book. Go moonlight and make more money for this family, etc., etc. Okay, and so I've always liked reading. I've always wanted to develop my brain. And my father was a big reader, and so were my uncles. And I envisioned myself that someday when I was a man, I'd be a big reader, and I wanted to be a scholar. And I remember all these people I met, like at Stanford, that had an impression on me that were pretty scholarly, and I wanted to be someday pretty scholarly. So I think that's helping to maintain the brain. And I've seen patients like this whose brains look like crap, but they're still doing pretty good. And I think it's because they built up cognitive reserve. So I would recommend that for everybody. So what I'm saying is that reading is not a waste of time. Whatever you're reading, if you enjoy it, if it's interesting to you, then it's good for you. So this is the cognitive reserve theory. But I'm also going to tell you also, what do I think of the cognitive reserve theory in the context of Alzheimer's? I think Alzheimer's is such a thing as familial Alzheimer's, a rare type that often causes a premature dementia. But I think the so-called sporadic Alzheimer's that they claim is the most common cause of dementia, I think that's fake. I think it's bogus. I think it's an exaggerated diagnosis that they just exaggerated about to get funding money for it. I don't think that explains dementia at all, because I almost never see the characteristic appearance of so-called sporadic Alzheimer's with focal parietal temporal atrophy, and it's not reliably diagnosed, even at autopsy, the so-called sporadic Alzheimer's. So you know what I think of dementia. I've already told you all about deletory theory, Yamashima theory, my own theory, supply and demand. I think that's the accurate way to view it. But anyways, any type of education you do that you're interested in, and these other things to protect your brain and increase neurogenesis, I think they're all good. So anyways, I hope you found that helpful.